and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm Robin Montague, and in these videos we get to meet researchers sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. This week is a first for us. We're not only chatting to experts from the University of Portsmouth, but also their collaborators. We're going to be joined by Matt Higgins from our Faculty of Creative and Cultural Industries, survival expert and visiting senior research fellow John Leach, and psychologist Dr. Sarita Robinson from the University of Central Lancashire. Sounds like an odd mix, but we promise there is a method to the madness. It's Zombie Awareness Month. Yes, that is a thing. Whilst the characters on the big screen might get to live, or alternatively meet quite a sticky end, would they have the same outcome in a real-world scenario? How does the fantasy of the zombie thriller match up with reality? And what real-life survival and psychological skills can we learn from the fictional world? So if you're feeling brave, let's get cracking. So yes, thank you all so much for joining me today. A bit of a weird one, appreciate that, but we got you in here, so that's something. So we'll start with Matt, actually. So for someone like you, who is, fair to say, quite a big zombie fan for pop fiction, you'll appreciate TV shows like The Last of Us. We have had quite extensive chats and gone down quite a few wormholes when it comes to that. But for those who are less familiar with this, I suppose we kind of have to label it as a horror genre. Where did this whole zombie uprising and interest in zombie culture, I suppose, develop?
Oh man, it goes back a while, and it's twisted and turned. So weirdly, it starts with Haitian culture. And specifically Haitian slaves. And it kind of stems from a belief and a superstition that if they tried to escape their situation via suicide, they would be punished by being brought back to life and kept in their rotting undead bodies. So it was really grim stuff. We could see where the origins of zombies are there. So a little bit of grim. And that kind of leads into like voodoo religion and the idea of like witch doctors and shamans being able to like revive people, which that kind of then led to the first kind of depictions of zombies in kind of like media. So I think the first film technically is I think White Zombie, which is kind of, it's more of the indoctrination side of being a zombie. So it's about kind of I think a plantation owner who uses a voodoo witch doctor to kind of what's the word? Mind control his kind of workers for whatever reason. But there's elements there of kind of what we see today in zombies, which is the idea of like the swarms of mindless people in that case. So that kind of the first technically kind of zombie film, but they're not zombies as we know them. And weirdly, I think the origins of like how we know zombies comes from I Am Legend. We did have a depiction in the last few years. I think it was about a decade ago now. With Will Smith.
What a great film.
It was a great film, yeah. I think they're doing a new one. I think there's going to be one with, like, and they're changing the ending or so, yeah. But the book, I think it's Richard Matheson, is like back in the 50s. It's about vampires. But the way they're depicted, it sets the stage for a lot of the kind of a post-apocalyptic fiction in the first place. So it's set in a kind of post-nuclear winter world, and there's like only a few people left, and literally only one man left. And at night, the vampires come out and they attack his house, and they're kind of out. I think during the day he goes out and hunts them. But there's aspects of what we know to be zombies now, especially in the sense that in the book, at least, they are kind of virally spread. So we've got an aspect of kind of zombies, but they're vampires. But they have the same idea. If they have a singular weakness, you have to go for the heart, not the brain. And they swarm. They're mass. They're en masse. There's hordes of them. So we have some of the first seeds of kind of the zombie pandemic kind of genre there. So that kind of sets the blueprint for basically how we treat zombies now.
And it interests me there when you say that the sort of, from depictions from the start, we're talking, the past couple of decades, especially in movies and TV adaptations, they all seem to, they have all previously seemed to be mindless to some extent. Yes, so they're doing things that are without their, they aren't within the right frame of mind, to put it in the best way of the
instinctual. They're
exactly.
Animals,
they're not being rational, and it's in irrational fear. It's something that they cannot. People that are running away from them cannot control. However, in more recent adaptations I've noticed over the past couple of years, I think like Army of the Dead, for instance, on Netflix, they actually have lives. The zombies have families, it blew my mind watching that, because I thought, well, okay, we're a thing that has always historically been dehumanized, and we're now beginning to humanize them.
It's really weird. And even going back to like the Dawn of the Dead series, there's aspects where they try and kind of make you empathize with the zombies, even though they're the downfall. They're eating people and they're the downfall of civilization. Even if you go back to, is it in? Oh, there's Dawn of the Dead and then there's Day of the Dead. Even there, they have like a zombie called Bub, and he's being trained to kind of like be cognizant to some degree, and he can kind of, I think by the end, I think he can hold a gun and fire it, and he chases some of the army men.
And while obviously it's always fun to sit here and talk about zombies all day, we're not just talking about zombies themselves. We're talking about how people would react in the event of a zombie apocalypse. So how would, does the fiction support the fact when we see these protagonists coming in, surviving and seeming to like group together or not group together, for instance? Does the research support how that's played out? Would we actually potentially act that way in a real world scenario? Hopefully never is going to happen.
You never know now.
I know. and that's obviously where our other guests come into this, so Sarita and John. And before we get into that side of things, I just want to obviously say we don't want to be flippant about the parallels that this conversation may have with the recent coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, we are talking about a fictional scenario with zombies, but there are going to be a certain few things that might align with that. So we are very much aware of that before we get into this conversation. So Sarita, we're going to start with you then. You've actually done a fair bit of sort of discussion around apocalyptic scenarios. It's not the first time a conversation like this has fallen on your lap. So just to start, when we had the coronavirus lockdown, a lot of people were, I suppose, people who were laughed at previously for having plans in action for these sort of scenarios were then seen to be the opposite. They were kind of, seen to be sensible, I suppose. So why is that?
So I suppose I'd sort of experienced this myself, that when I told people that I was a prepper and that I would prepare for different emergencies, you'd sort of get this look of sort of disbelief of why would you bother? But from all the research that I did all the way through my PhD and then afterwards, it became very apparent that victims were made even before the incident happened. And it was that lack of preparedness that really predicted whether somebody was going to be a survivor later on. So I was that person at the start of the pandemic who had, the 3-month supply of food at home. I had excess toilet roll, probably a year's supply, which I then distributed to friends who perhaps hadn't prepped as well. But I do remember that when we were sort of closing down the university, we had like 3 days notice that the university was going to close, and the dean of school, he came to me and he said, "Oh, Sarita said, yes, we used to laugh at you before, but we're not laughing now." And there was 2 elements to that. The first was what used to laugh at me. And the second was, yes, actually, the preparedness, that planning is something that's really, really important. And the time to prep, as I said, is before the incident occurs. It's no use reading the book on how to survive while the zombie apocalypse is ongoing. We really need to prep for things.
And how would you recommend people go about prepping then? I mean, I've seen people with bunkers under their homes. I've seen people with literally rooms full of tin cans, and I'm not condoning this in any way, but, weapons. So how much prepping are you talking about here?
So in America, this idea of, the survivalist sort of mentality, and they drive around like bit Mad Max style with Land Rovers and shun-off shotguns. We're not talking that. Prepping for me is about having the basics in place. So basic first aid training. Yeah, can you help somebody if there's a first aid incident? You don't want to be downloading it on an app while somebody's, having a heart attack. It's just not really useful at that moment. You've got to be prepared beforehand. Basic things like having some food is really useful, but it's about scanning the environment, knowing where the potential dangers are, and making sure that you think about what could go wrong and do an intervention beforehand. So things like having a fire blanket, having a little fire extinguisher in your kitchen is much more useful if your microwave goes a bit funny at some point than if you haven't. So it's really basic things, little tiny alterations to the way you live that can just have this huge advantage if things do go wrong.
And you said there about having like basic first aid training. You'll find in, again, fictional depictions. I'm thinking of The Walking Dead. The main character, police officer.
Yeah.
He obviously had first aid training. So have you found, Matt, that in these fictional depictions, actually it is usually people with first aid backgrounds or have a bit more of that survival knowledge, and they have prepped, seem to be the ones that are more likely to survive or take the protagonist role?
Oh, sometimes. Like, I think there's an appeal for kind of, there's a lot of protagonists that have like a military background, and so their expertise comes from that kind of military side, or they really aren't prepared, and the kind of the medical attention is often slapdash, which I think has a cinematic appeal to it. I think that's why we kind of often see that. So like, yeah, sometimes like, so yeah, you've got Rick Grimes, and in the kind of Dawn of the Dead series, it's often it's military, or I think in one of them it's a doctor. Then even things like Shaun of the Dead, you've just got a bunch of random people that were really not prepared and that have no idea what they're doing there. So sometimes, yes, but I think there's often appeal in kind of the everyman with zero understanding, and kind of having to kind of try and chop off limbs to stop the infection, or try and kind of guesstimate a tourniquet and all that kind of stuff. It's a lot more interesting to watch, I think.
So that segues quite nicely into my next question. You said everyman, the everyday man. And Sarita, actually, you have a bit of research to support this. So why is it always seems to be like, because in the movies, the men always take the lead. They'll always sort of go head first into danger, it seems. Sarita, is that something that you find as well in real world scenarios, in the event of, say, an earthquake or a flood? What type of person tends to be more likely to survive?
So that's a $64 million question, isn't it? It's like, who's going to be a survivor and who's going to be a victim? Now, as I said before, prepping is a little part of that, making sure that you're prepared ahead of time. But then people say, oh, is there a certain personality type potentially that's going to be better at surviving, or is there a certain characteristic? Now, I would say that young men potentially don't have all of the sort of skills and things that they need to keep them through. And actually, if I was to say who's going to be your best survivor, I'd say it's mums and dads. Yeah, people who've got caring responsibilities. If you think about it, parents are the people that have a go bag with them all the time. Yeah, they're prepared for anything, but they don't call it a go bag. That it's the nappy bag. It's the stuff that the kids' medicine and food, change of clothing, all those things is already in, and they take it around. So people, would say to me, oh, you've got a go bag, that's really weird. And it's like, no, actually, if you look around, all the parents in this room also have a go bag. So I would definitely say that there are some people who may just be a little bit more invested in surviving, and that can be people with caring responsibilities, because they're not responsible just for themselves but for other people, whereas young men tend to be quite free and single a lot of the time, and therefore they're just on their own path and can run at the zombie with a chainsaw and not worry about the consequences.
And another thing as well, I think, to take into note is that you find you've got the sort of the loner is probably the best way to describe them, the person that goes off and decides to fend for themselves. Last of Us again, there's that character obviously who pretty much creates an entire town.
Bill, yeah.
Bill, what a man. So obviously Bill goes off and does that, but then he eventually finds actually he is lonely and he needs, again, no spoilers, but clearly there's going to be spoilers in this, sorry guys. But do you also find that in reality, people that tend to go off alone, are they more likely to survive, do you think, or are they just separating themselves from the pack?
Yeah, I sort of think that social support networks are really important. Sometimes your lone survivor is great and they've got everything that they need and they're not having to worry about other people, so they can just focus on themselves. But humans are quite social creatures. They get a lot of the strength and resilience from that social network, and they can draw on that power. And as a group, as long as it's a well-functioning group, then I think survival chances are enhanced.
And John, just bringing you into the fold here as well, there's something that you've spoken about at length before, and I feel this is definitely something that I fall within. This whole concept of give-up-itis, I think is the right phrase. So what is that, and what do you mean when you say that give-up-itis is something that people tend to experience?
What people do in a survival situation is not what we normally expect people to do. Now, we're always looking for patterns in nature, and that's when I started to look at how people behaved in real events, debriefing survivors, being in on experimental work with various institutions, did a lot of work with shipwreck and sea survival in the early days. But that also extended across to people who ended up in the desert, who ended up in the jungle, to man-made extreme environments such as concentration camp survivors. I was also involved with hostage work some time ago. And it was through that I started to get a picture of the pattern on how people did respond and why they were behaving in the way they were doing. So people die in situations where they did not have to die in those situations. And they can die quite quickly as well. And that intrigued me.
If you'd like to find out more about the psychology, history and pop culture of the zombie apocalypse, listen to the full episode of Life Solved on the University of Portsmouth website or your favourite podcast app now. You can click the link in the comments box below or head to port.ac.uk/research. See you again next time.